The artificial gravity aboard the Meridian Explorer felt heavier than usual as Dr. Kai Richardson adjusted his formal diplomatic uniform for the third time in 10 minutes. His hands shook slightly as he fastened the ceremonial pins that marked him as Earth's primary xenobiological consultant, a title that sounded impressive but felt increasingly inadequate as he prepared for humanity's first formal contact with the Zephyrian delegation. Remember, no direct eye contact during initial introductions, Ambassador Williams reminded him through the comm system. And whatever you do, don't offer to shake hands. Their cultural briefing specifically mentioned that unsolicited physical contact is considered aggressive. Kai nodded, though Williams couldn't see him from the bridge. 6 months of preparation, countless hours studying Zephyrian customs and language patterns, and he still felt like he was about to stumble through the most important moment in human history. The irony wasn't lost on him that someone who had spent his career studying alien life forms was now terrified of actually meeting one. The docking bay doors hissed open with mechanical precision, and the Zephyrian shuttle glided through the atmospheric containment field with technology that made human engineering look primitive by comparison. Kai watched through the observation deck's reinforced transparisteel as the vessel settled onto the landing platform, its surface shimmering with what appeared to be living metal that rippled and adjusted to accommodate the docking clamps. "Showtime, people," Ambassador Williams announced over the ship-wide communication system. "Remember, we're representing all of humanity today. Let's not accidentally start an interstellar war." "No pressure at all," Kai muttered, straightening his collar one final time before making his way to the reception area. The diplomatic reception chamber had been carefully prepared according to Zephyrian specifications, neutral lighting that wouldn't strain their enhanced visual systems, atmospheric composition adjusted to accommodate their respiratory needs, and furniture arranged to reflect their preferences for symmetrical spatial organization. Everything was perfect, sterile, and utterly intimidating. Kai took his position in the formal receiving line, flanked by Ambassador Williams, Chief Science Officer Martinez, and a handful of other officials whose names he'd forgotten in his nervousness. The chamber's main doors dilated with a soft whisper of displaced air, and the Zephyrian delegation entered. He had seen images and video recordings of Zephyrians during his preparation, but nothing had prepared him for the reality of their presence. They moved with fluid grace that made human locomotion seem clumsy by comparison, their elongated ears catching and directing sound with obvious intelligence. Their skin held a subtle luminescence that shifted slightly with what Kai assumed were emotional states, and their eyes were larger than human proportions, adapted for their homeworld's dimmer star. But it was the woman leading the delegation who commanded his attention completely. Ambassador Lyra, according to his briefing materials, chief negotiator for the Zephyrian Diplomatic Corps and reportedly one of their most brilliant legal minds. She wore robes that seemed to be woven from starlight itself, and when she moved, the fabric caught the chamber's lighting in ways that suggested advanced nanotechnology integrated into the very threads. The formal introductions proceeded with careful precision. Ambassador Williams stepped forward, offering the traditional Zephyrian greeting gesture, a complex movement involving both hands that represented the sharing of knowledge between equals. Lyra responded with elegant economy of motion, her expression maintaining the neutral composure that Zephyrian diplomacy apparently required. "On behalf of the United Earth Government, we welcome you to the Meridian Explorer," Williams said, his words carefully translated by the universal communication interface they'd spent months calibrating. "The Zephyrian consensus acknowledges your hospitality," Lyra replied, her voice carrying harmonics that the translation system couldn't quite capture. "We approach these discussions with hope for mutual understanding." The formal pleasantries continued as each member of the human delegation was introduced in turn. Chief Science Officer Martinez managed her introduction without incident, as did the other officials. Then it was Kai's turn, and somehow, despite months of preparation and endless rehearsals, everything went wrong. He stepped forward as Ambassador Williams began his introduction. "Dar. Kai Richardson, our chief xenobiological consultant and specialist in interspecies communication protocols." Kai looked directly at Lyra, meeting her large, intelligent eyes with what he intended as respectful attention. The effect was immediate and obviously wrong. her ears twitched backward in what he suddenly remembered was a Zephyrian expression of surprise or alarm, and several other members of her delegation shifted uncomfortably. Realizing his mistake, Kai panicked and did the exact thing he'd been warned against. He extended his hand toward Lyra in an automatic human gesture of greeting. The silence that followed was so complete that Kai could hear the ship's life support systems humming in the background. Lyra stared at his extended hand as if it might explode, while Ambassador Williams made a strangled sound that might have been a suppressed groan. But then something unexpected happened. Lyra's ears, which had been flattened against her head in alarm, began to twitch forward slightly. The corners of her mouth curved upward in what Kai was fairly certain was the beginning of a smile, though her diplomatic training kept her expression carefully neutral. Dr. Richardson appears to favor directness over protocol, she said, and Kai caught what sounded like amusement in the harmonics of her voice. An interesting approach. I apologize for the cultural oversight, Kai said quickly, withdrawing his hand and trying to recover some dignity. I'm apparently better at studying alien customs than practicing them. Studying alien customs? Lyra repeated, and now her ears were definitely expressing something that looked like suppressed mirth. From my perspective, Dr. Richardson, you are the alien. I am simply following established diplomatic procedures. The comment broke the tension in the room, and Kai found himself laughing despite his embarrassment. You're absolutely right. I suppose that's the problem with first contact, everyone thinks they're the normal ones. Indeed, Lyra agreed, and Kai was certain he detected warmth in her tone now. Perhaps we should establish new protocols that account for mutual alienness. Ambassador Williams cleared his throat diplomatically. Perhaps we should move to the formal conference chamber for the scheduled discussions. The next several hours passed in a blur of diplomatic presentations, cultural exchange protocols, and carefully worded agreements about future cooperation. Kai found himself serving as an unofficial interpreter, not of language, the translation systems handled that adequately, but of intent and context. When the human delegation used euphemisms or diplomatic circumlocutions, he would quietly explain the underlying meaning to Lyra. When the Zephyrians made statements that seemed blunt or dismissive to human ears, he helped his colleagues understand the cultural context that made such directness appropriate. Throughout the formal sessions, he became increasingly aware of Lyra's presence. She was brilliant, clearly, with a mind that could dissect complex legal and scientific concepts with surgical precision. But there was also something else, a curiosity about human behavior that went beyond professional interest, and a sense of humor that emerged in subtle ways despite the formal diplomatic setting. When the official sessions finally concluded for the day, Kai was exhausted but oddly exhilarated. The cultural exchange had been more successful than anyone had dared hope, with both sides expressing cautious optimism about future cooperation. As the delegations prepared to retire to their respective quarters, Kai found himself walking alone through the ship's main corridor, reviewing the day's events and wondering if he'd imagined the moments of connection he'd felt with the Zephyrian ambassador. Dr. Richardson. Kai turned to find Lyra approaching, having somehow moved through the corridor without making a sound. Up close, without the formal diplomatic setting, she seemed simultaneously more alien and more approachable. Ambassador Lyra, he said, offering a slight bow that he hoped was more appropriate than his earlier handshake attempt. I wanted to apologize again for my cultural mistakes during the introduction ceremony. Your mistakes were illuminating, she said, moving closer until they were standing in a small alcove beside one of the ship's observation windows. Beyond the transparisteel, stars wheeled slowly as the Meridian Explorer maintained its position in the diplomatic neutral zone. They revealed something about human nature that formal protocols would have obscured. What's that? Kai asked, genuinely curious. Authenticity, Lyra said simply. Your diplomatic colleagues were so focused on following proper procedures that their actions felt rehearsed, artificial. But your mistakes were genuine expressions of how you naturally interact with others. Kai considered this. So you're saying that accidentally insulting your cultural sensibilities was somehow better than following diplomatic protocol? I'm saying that your willingness to be vulnerable, to risk embarrassment in service of making a genuine connection, demonstrated something valuable about human character. Lyra's ears had shifted into what Kai was beginning to recognize as a position indicating thoughtfulness. It made me curious about what other surprises your species might offer. We're full of surprises, Kai agreed with a smile. Most of them probably less diplomatically appropriate than what happened today. Perhaps that's exactly what makes them interesting, Lyra replied, and there was definitely warmth in her voice now. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the stars and the distant lights of their respective vessels. The moment felt suspended, full of possibilities that neither diplomatic protocol nor cultural briefings had prepared them for. Then Lyra turned to face him directly, her large eyes reflecting the starlight from the observation window. Dr. Richardson, I have a question that goes beyond the formal diplomatic discussions. What's that? Kai asked, though something in her tone suggested this wasn't going to be a simple scientific inquiry. What do you want, human? She asked, her voice carrying a directness that was pure Zephyrian but somehow intimate rather than clinical. Kai looked at her. Really looked at her, taking in the elegant sweep of her ears, the intelligence in her eyes, the way starlight seemed to gather in her luminescent skin. The question seemed to demand the same kind of honesty that had gotten him in trouble during the formal introductions, the same authenticity she'd said she found valuable. You, he said simply, the word escaping before his diplomatic training could stop it. For a heartbeat, Lyra stared at him in apparent shock. Then she threw back her head and laughed, a sound like music that made the ship's corridors seem less sterile and the vast distance between stars seem less daunting. That, she said when her laughter finally subsided, is the most honest thing anyone has said to me since I arrived on this vessel. It's also probably the most diplomatically inappropriate thing I could have said, Kai admitted, though he found he didn't regret the words. Perhaps, Lyra agreed, her ears now expressing what looked like pure delight. But inappropriate honesty is infinitely more interesting than appropriate deception. As she walked away, her robes shimmering in the corridor's lighting, Kai realized that his carefully planned approach to first contact had just become infinitely more complicated. And somehow, despite all his diplomatic training and professional reservations, he couldn't bring himself to mind. The communication breakdown happened on day 3 of the diplomatic talks, and it started with something as simple as lunch. Kai had been looking forward to the informal meal-sharing session that both delegations had agreed would help foster cultural understanding. The Meridian Explorer's dining facility had been modified to accommodate Zephyrian dietary requirements. Their food appeared to be some kind of luminescent paste that changed colors based on nutritional content, which was fascinating from a xenobiological perspective and slightly disturbing from a human culinary standpoint. This is quite pleasant, Ambassador Williams was saying to the assembled delegates, gesturing toward his own meal of reconstituted protein and vitamin supplements. It's wonderful to share a meal in the spirit of friendship and cooperation. Lyra, seated directly across from Kai, had been observing the humans eat with obvious scientific interest. When Williams finished his diplomatic pleasantries, she tilted her head in that characteristically Zephyrian way and asked, "Why do you find the consumption of nutrients pleasant?" The biological necessity of caloric intake serves a functional purpose, but I do not understand the emotional component you attach to this activity. The human delegation fell silent. Ambassador Williams's smile became slightly strained as he processed the cultural implications of Lyra's question. Well, Williams began carefully, sharing meals is a bonding activity for humans. It represents community, hospitality, the sharing of resources. But those are merely social constructs applied to a biological function, interrupted another Zephyrian delegate, whose name Kai remembered as Theorist Vex. Surely intelligent beings can achieve social bonding through more efficient means than the simultaneous consumption of nutrients. Chief Science Officer Martinez put down her fork with visible frustration. Are you suggesting that human social customs are primitive? Not primitive, Lyra replied with diplomatic precision, merely inefficient. The time spent in food preparation and consumption could be allocated to more productive activities. Like what? Martinez shot back, her voice carrying an edge that made Kai wince. Intellectual discourse, technological development, philosophical exploration, Vex replied matter-of-factly. Activities that advance civilization rather than maintaining biological systems. The temperature in the dining room seemed to drop several degrees. Kai could see Ambassador Williams calculating diplomatic responses while Martinez looked like she was considering several non-diplomatic ones. The other human delegates were exchanging glances that suggested the cultural exchange was about to become significantly less friendly. Perhaps, Kai said, standing up before the situation could deteriorate further, the difference isn't about efficiency versus inefficiency, but about different approaches to the same goal. All eyes turned toward him, and he felt the familiar flutter of nervousness that came with being the center of attention. But Lyra was looking at him with what appeared to be genuine curiosity, her ears positioned in a way that suggested she was interested in what he might say. Humans achieve social bonding through shared activities that engage multiple senses, Kai continued, warming to his theme. Food preparation involves creativity, the sharing of meals creates temporal synchronization, we're all doing the same thing at the same time, and the act of eating together establishes trust through mutual vulnerability. Mutual vulnerability? Lyra asked, her tone shifting from diplomatic neutrality to genuine interest. When you eat with someone, you're focused on something other than maintaining social defenses, Kai explained. Your attention is partly on the food, your body is engaged in a biological process, you're temporarily less guarded. It creates opportunities for authentic interaction. Lyra's ears twitched and what he'd learned was her expression of concentration. So the inefficiency is intentional? A deliberate reduction in social barriers? Exactly, Kai said, feeling pleased that she was following his reasoning. What looks like wasted time is actually invested time. We're trading immediate efficiency for long-term social cohesion. Fascinating, Vex interjected. But surely direct communication would achieve the same result more efficiently. Would it, though? Kai asked, glancing around the table. How many crucial insights have emerged from this conversation that wouldn't have happened if we'd simply scheduled a formal discussion about social bonding theory? The human delegates were beginning to look interested rather than offended, and several of the Zephyrians had shifted their body language in ways that suggested engagement rather than skepticism. You're suggesting that human inefficiency serves a meta-purpose, Lyra said thoughtfully. That the apparent waste of resources actually generates value that direct approaches cannot achieve. I'm suggesting that different species might have evolved different optimization strategies, Kai replied. Zephyrians appear to optimize for intellectual and technological advancement. Humans optimize for social flexibility and emotional resilience. But emotional resilience is not quantifiable, Vex pointed out. How do you measure the value of such a thing? Martinez laughed, and for the first time since the conversation began, it sounded genuinely amused rather than defensive. How do you measure the value of art, or music, or falling in love? Some things are valuable precisely because they can't be quantified. Falling in love? Lyra's ears had shifted into an expression Kai couldn't quite read. This is the human bonding practice that involves irrational behavior and compromised decision-making. Among other things, Williams admitted with a diplomatic smile. Though we prefer to think of it as expanded emotional capacity and heightened motivation for collaborative behavior. It sounds inefficient, Vex observed. It is, Kai agreed cheerfully. Completely, wildly, beautifully inefficient. And also one of the most powerful forces for positive change in human society. Lyra was staring at him with an intensity that made him slightly self-conscious. You find inefficiency beautiful? I find the unexpected results of inefficiency beautiful, Kai clarified. When you stop optimizing for a specific outcome, you create space for outcomes you never could have planned. Some of humanity's greatest achievements came from people who were supposedly wasting time on impractical projects. Examples? Lyra asked, and Kai could tell she was genuinely interested now rather than just being polite. Music, for one. No clear survival advantage, massive investment of time and resources, completely impractical from a biological perspective. But it's led to everything from improved pattern recognition to enhanced mathematical thinking to the development of technologies that have revolutionized how we process information. The acoustic research that led to your faster-than-light communication systems originated from musical instrument development, Martinez added, catching Kai's direction. Something that started as entertainment became the foundation for interstellar contact. Art, literature, philosophy, Kai continued. None of them have obvious practical applications, but they've shaped how humans think about everything from engineering to governance to scientific methodology. Lyra's expression had shifted to something that looked almost like wonder. Your species pursues knowledge without predetermined utility? All the time, Williams confirmed. We call it basic research, or pure science, or sometimes just curiosity. But surely such approaches result in enormous waste of resources, Vex protested. Absolutely, Kai agreed. We waste incredible amounts of time and energy on projects that never lead anywhere useful. But the projects that do lead somewhere often revolutionize entire fields of knowledge. It's like biological evolution, Martinez added. Most mutations are harmful or neutral, but the beneficial ones change everything. You can't get the beneficial mutations without accepting the waste involved in the harmful ones. Lyra was quiet for several long moments, her ears shifting through expressions that suggested deep thought. The communication breakdown happened on day 3 of the diplomatic talks, and it started with something as simple as lunch. Kai had been looking forward to the informal meal-sharing session that both delegations had agreed would help foster cultural understanding. The Meridian Explorer's dining facility had been modified to accommodate Zephyrian dietary requirements. Their food appeared to be some kind of luminescent paste that changed colors based on nutritional content, which was fascinating from a xenobiological perspective and slightly disturbing from a human culinary standpoint. This is quite pleasant, Ambassador Williams was saying to the assembled delegates, gesturing toward his own meal of reconstituted protein and vitamin supplements. It's wonderful to share a meal in the spirit of friendship and cooperation. Lyra, seated directly across from Kai, had been observing the humans eat with obvious scientific interest. When Williams finished his diplomatic pleasantries, she tilted her head in that characteristically Zephyrian way and asked, "Why do you find the consumption of nutrients pleasant?" The biological necessity of caloric intake serves a functional purpose, but I do not understand the emotional component you attach to this activity. The human delegation fell silent. Ambassador Williams's smile became slightly strained as he processed the cultural implications of Lyra's question. Well, Williams began carefully, sharing meals is a bonding activity for humans. It represents community, hospitality, the sharing of resources. But those are merely social constructs applied to a biological function, interrupted another Zephyrian delegate, whose name Kai remembered as Theorist Vex. Surely intelligent beings can achieve social bonding through more efficient means than the simultaneous consumption of nutrients. Chief Science Officer Martinez put down her fork with visible frustration. Are you suggesting that human social customs are primitive? Not primitive, Lyra replied with diplomatic precision, merely inefficient. The time spent in food preparation and consumption could be allocated to more productive activities. Like what? Martinez shot back, her voice carrying an edge that made Kai wince. Intellectual discourse, technological development, philosophical exploration, Vex replied matter-of-factly. Activities that advance civilization rather than maintaining biological systems. The temperature in the dining room seemed to drop several degrees. Kai could see Ambassador Williams calculating diplomatic responses while Martinez looked like she was considering several non-diplomatic ones. The other human delegates were exchanging glances that suggested the cultural exchange was about to become significantly less friendly. Perhaps, Kai said, standing up before the situation could deteriorate further, the difference isn't about efficiency versus inefficiency, but about different approaches to the same goal. All eyes turned toward him, and he felt the familiar flutter of nervousness that came with being the center of attention. But Lyra was looking at him with what appeared to be genuine curiosity, her ears positioned in a way that suggested she was interested in what he might say. Humans achieve social bonding through shared activities. 3 weeks into the extended cultural exchange program, Kai had learned that Zephyrian courtship rituals made human dating look straightforward by comparison. He'd also discovered that falling in love with someone from a species that considered emotional decisions, fascinatingly irrational, presented unique challenges. "I still don't understand the purpose of these flowers," Lyra said, examining the bouquet of artificial roses he presented to her with the kind of scientific intensity she usually reserved for diplomatic negotiations. They were sitting in the Meridian Explorer's arboretum, surrounded by earth plants that had been genetically modified to thrive in shipboard conditions. "You have deliberately killed living organisms and presented their reproductive organs to me as a gesture of affection?" "When you put it that way, it does sound somewhat disturbing," Kai admitted, watching her turn the flowers over in her hands with obvious bewilderment. "But the symbolism is supposed to be romantic. Beauty that's temporary, effort expended for purely aesthetic purposes, the offering of something valuable that serves no practical function." "Ah," Lyra said, her ears shifting into their position of understanding. "More optimized inefficiency. You are demonstrating your willingness to waste resources on my behalf as an indicator of emotional investment." "That's..." Kai paused, considering her interpretation. "Actually, that's disturbingly accurate. I never thought about it that way, but yes, expensive gestures without practical value are considered romantic in human culture." "Your species is endlessly fascinating," Lyra said, setting the flowers aside with careful precision. "Though I confess I find your approach to relationship formation rather chaotic." "Chaotic how?" Kai asked, though he suspected he knew what she meant. "You base critical life decisions on emotional responses that change unpredictably, you engage in bonding activities without clear compatibility assessments, and you appear to value uncertainty as a desirable component of romantic attachment." Lyra's tone was clinical, but Kai had learned to read the subtle expressions of her ears, which were currently indicating affection despite her analytical words. "From a Zephyrian perspective, your mating practices are approximately equivalent to randomly selecting life partners from the general population." "Okay, when you describe human romance as randomly selecting life partners, it does sound pretty inefficient," Kai conceded. "But there's method to our madness. Emotions provide information about compatibility that logical analysis might miss." "What kind of information?" Lyra asked, settling into the meditation posture that Zephyrians adopted for serious discussions. "Physical chemistry, for one thing. Humans produce pheromones and respond to subtle biological signals that indicate genetic compatibility. Love at first sight might actually be unconscious recognition of optimal genetic pairing." Kai found himself moving into his teaching mode, the same way he approached complex xenobiological concepts. "But beyond that, emotional attraction often indicates psychological complementarity. We're drawn to people who balance our weaknesses and enhance our strengths. But surely such determinations could be made more efficiently through direct assessment rather than relying on emotional responses," Lyra pointed out. "Could they, though?" Kai asked. "How would you directly assess whether someone makes you laugh, or whether their presence makes you feel calm, or whether you enjoy their company enough to want to share decades of daily experiences with them?" Lyra was quiet for a moment, her ears shifting through several positions that suggested deep consideration. "Zephyrian bonding practices focus on intellectual and practical compatibility. We assess shared interests, complementary skills, aligned life goals, and mutual respect for each other's achievements." "That sounds very sensible," Kai said carefully. "But do Zephyrians experience what humans would call romantic love?" "We experience." Lyra paused, searching for words. "Appreciation for exceptional individuals. Attraction to brilliant minds. Satisfaction in productive partnerships." Her ears had moved into a position he didn't recognize, something between thoughtfulness and uncertainty. "But what you describe, the emotional intensity, the irrational prioritization of another being's welfare over your own, the desire for physical and emotional intimacy, these things are not standard components of Zephyrian relationships. Do you think they could be?" Kai asked gently. Lyra looked at him with an expression that seemed to contain multitudes of unspoken thoughts. "Dr. Richardson," Kai. I must tell you something about my presence on this vessel. What's that? Kai asked, though something in her tone made him apprehensive. The extended cultural exchange program was not originally planned to include my participation, Lyra said, her words careful and precisely chosen. I volunteered to remain aboard the Meridian Explorer specifically to study human social interactions. More specifically, to understand why I found my interactions with you so compelling. Kai felt his heart rate increase, though he wasn't sure if it was from excitement or concern. You're studying me? I was, Lyra admitted, her ears now expressing what looked like embarrassment. Initially. But the study parameters became compromised when I realized that my interest in you had evolved beyond scientific curiosity. Meaning what, exactly? Kai asked, though he thought he might already know the answer. Meaning that I appear to be experiencing what you would call romantic attraction, Lyra said, the words emerging with obvious difficulty. Which is problematic for numerous reasons, not least of which is that such emotions are considered evidence of psychological instability in Zephyrian society. Kai stared at her, processing the implications of what she just revealed. So when you laugh at my jokes, or when your ears do that thing that means you're happy to see me, or when you ask questions about human emotions, you're not just being academically curious. No, Lyra said quietly. I am not. The silence that followed was filled with the gentle hum of the Arboretum's life support systems and the distant sounds of the ship's operations. Kai found himself looking at Lyra with new eyes, seeing not just the brilliant diplomat and fascinating alien, but someone who was struggling with feelings that challenged everything she'd been taught about rational behavior. How do Zephyrians typically handle romantic attraction? Kai asked finally. We don't, Lyra replied with characteristic directness. Individuals who experience such emotions undergo psychological treatment to restore logical thinking patterns. The condition is considered a temporary malfunction that interferes with optimal decision-making. And what happens if the treatment doesn't work? Lyra's ears flattened against her head in an expression he'd never seen before, one that seemed to indicate genuine distress. Individuals who cannot overcome romantic attachment are classified as psychologically unsuitable for positions requiring rational judgment. They are typically reassigned to less critical roles where emotional instability will not compromise their effectiveness. Kai felt a surge of anger at the casual dismissal of something humans considered one of life's most valuable experiences. So if you continue to have feelings for me, it could destroy your career. Yes, Lyra said simply. And you're telling me this because I wanted you to understand the implications of my interest in you, Lyra replied. And because I hoped you might help me understand whether what I'm experiencing is worth the potential consequences. Kai looked at her, really looked at her, taking in the elegant sweep of her ears, the intelligence in her large eyes, the subtle luminescence of her skin that seemed to reflect her emotional state. She was beautiful in ways that human aesthetic standards couldn't fully capture, brilliant beyond anything he'd ever encountered, and brave enough to risk everything she'd worked for in order to explore feelings her entire species considered pathological. Lyra, he said softly, can I show you something about human courtship that might help you make that decision? What? She asked, her ears shifting to indicate curiosity mixed with apprehension. Instead of answering, Kai moved closer to her, slowly enough that she could object if she wanted to, until he was sitting directly beside her on the meditation cushion. Then, with infinite care, he reached out and took her hand in his. The effect was immediate. Lyra's breath caught, her eyes widened, and her skin began to glow more brightly, the luminescence shifting through colors he'd never seen before. Her ears moved into a position that seemed to indicate wonder mixed with something that might have been joy. This, Kai said softly, is what humans call intimacy. Physical contact that serves no practical purpose except to create connection, to demonstrate trust, to share warmth and presence. It's. Lyra stared down at their joined hands, her voice barely above a whisper. It's extraordinary. I can feel your pulse, your body temperature, the electrical activity in your nervous system. But more than that, I feel connected to you in a way I have never experienced before. That's what romantic love feels like, Kai said. Connection that goes beyond intellectual appreciation or practical compatibility. The sense that another person has become essential to your well-being in ways that have nothing to do with logic or efficiency. Lyra was quiet for a long moment, her thumb tracing small circles on the back of his hand in a gesture that seemed unconscious but sent electricity through his entire nervous system. Kai, she said finally, what you're describing, this connection, this intimacy, it is worth losing everything else for. That depends, Kai replied honestly. Do you feel like you're losing yourself, or like you're discovering parts of yourself you never knew existed? Lyra's ears shifted into their position of deep thought, and when she spoke, her voice carried a certainty he'd rarely heard from her. The latter, she said. Definitely the latter. Then maybe, Kai suggested, the question isn't whether romantic love is worth the consequences, but whether the consequences are worth avoiding if it means never discovering what you're capable of becoming. Lyra looked at him with an expression that seemed to contain all the wonder and terror of someone standing at the edge of an undiscovered country, ready to step into territory that no map could chart. In that case, she said, her luminescent skin shifting to colors that seemed to indicate resolve mixed with anticipation, I believe I would like to continue this experiment in human inefficiency. Even if it means risking everything you've worked for? Kai asked. Especially then, Lyra replied, and for the first time since he'd known her, her smile seemed to contain nothing but pure, irrational, beautiful human joy. The recall orders arrived simultaneously, transmitted across light years of space with the kind of bureaucratic efficiency that suggested both governments had been planning this moment for weeks. Kai stared at the official communication on his personal display, the words blurring slightly as he read them for the third time. Dr. Richardson, your immediate return to Earth is required for debriefing and reassignment to the Terran Xenobiology Institute. Transport will be provided via the next available diplomatic courier vessel. This assignment is classified as high priority and non-negotiable. Across the corridor, Lyra emerged from her quarters holding what appeared to be the Zephyrian equivalent, a crystalline data storage device that pulsed with soft light as it conveyed its message. Her ears were positioned in an expression he'd never seen before, one that seemed to indicate a combination of resignation and barely controlled anger. The diplomatic corps requires my immediate return to Zephyr Prime for psychological evaluation and career reassignment, she said without preamble. Apparently, my compromised objectivity has become a concern at the highest levels of government. They're separating us, Kai said, the reality of the situation settling over him like a physical weight. It would appear so, Lyra replied, though her clinical tone couldn't hide the emotion underlying her words. The timing suggests coordination between our respective authorities. They have determined that our personal involvement represents a threat to interspecies diplomatic relations. Kai felt a surge of frustration that had nothing to do with diplomatic protocol and everything to do with the prospect of losing the most extraordinary person he'd ever met to bureaucratic paranoia. What kind of threat? We've been more effective at facilitating communication between our species than any of the formal diplomatic channels. That may be precisely the problem, Lyra said, her ears shifting to indicate thoughtful analysis even in the midst of what was clearly emotional distress. Our success challenges the established power structures that control interspecies contact. If individuals can form meaningful relationships across species boundaries, it reduces the importance of institutional gatekeepers. So we're being punished for being too successful? Kai asked. We're being removed before our example can inspire others to prioritize personal connections over institutional loyalty, Lyra corrected, and the bitterness in her voice was unmistakably human in its emotional resonance. They stood in the corridor for several minutes, each processing the implications of their respective recall orders. Around them, the ship's normal operations continued. Crew members going about their duties, the gentle hum of life support systems, the distant sounds of ongoing diplomatic activities that would soon continue without either of them. There is something else, Lyra said finally, her voice so quiet that Kai had to move closer to hear her clearly. What? He asked, though he could tell from her expression that whatever she was about to say would make an already difficult situation worse. The recall order specifically mentioned that any attempt to decline reassignment will result in permanent career termination and loss of governmental security clearance, Lyra said, the words emerging with obvious reluctance. For both of us. Our governments appear to have coordinated not just the timing of our recalls, but the consequences of non-compliance. Kai felt something cold settle in his stomach as he realized what she was telling him. They're forcing us to choose between our careers and each other. More than our careers, Lyra corrected sadly. Our entire professional identities, our access to the work we love, our ability to contribute to the scientific and diplomatic communities that have shaped our lives. If we refuse these reassignments, we will be effectively exiled from everything that has given our lives meaning. Accept each other, Kai pointed out, though the words felt hollow even as he spoke them. Accept each other, Lyra agreed, but her ears had moved into a position that suggested she was considering implications he hadn't yet grasped. Though I wonder what kind of relationship could survive the resentment that might grow from such a sacrifice. The question hung in the air between them like a challenge to everything they thought they'd discovered about love transcending practical considerations. Kai found himself forced to confront the possibility that his romantic idealization of their connection might not be strong enough to withstand the reality of losing everything else that made him who he was. So what do we do? He asked finally. We have 48 hours to prepare for departure, Lyra replied, her tone suggesting she was already beginning to distance herself emotionally from their situation. I suggest we use that time to say our farewells and prepare for our respective futures. Just like that? Kai asked, unable to hide his disappointment. We're going to let them separate us without even trying to find alternatives. Lyra looked at him with an expression that seemed to contain all the sadness of someone watching something precious slip away despite their best efforts to hold on to it. What alternatives do you see, Kai? We are individuals from species that barely understand each other, working within institutions that view our relationship as a threat to their authority. We have no legal standing, no political power, and no resources beyond our personal convictions. Sometimes personal convictions are enough, Kai said, though he could hear the uncertainty in his own voice. Are they? Lyra asked gently. Are your feelings for me strong enough to justify destroying your career, abandoning your research, giving up your ability to contribute to xenobiological science? Because that is what we are discussing. Kai stared at her, realizing that she was asking him to quantify something that had always felt beyond measurement. How do you weigh love against purpose? How do you choose between personal happiness and professional fulfillment when both seem essential to who you are? I don't know, he admitted, the words feeling like a betrayal of everything he thought he believed about their connection. Neither do I, Lyra replied, and her honesty somehow made the situation both worse and better simultaneously. They spent the next 2 days in a strange state of suspended animation, going through the motions of preparing for departure while both avoiding and desperately seeking opportunities to spend time together. Their conversations became careful and formal, as if they were already practicing for a future in which they would be nothing more than professional colleagues who had once worked together on a successful diplomatic mission. But on their final evening aboard the Meridian Explorer, something shifted. Kai was packing his research materials when Lyra appeared at his quarters door, holding a data storage device that seemed to glow more brightly than usual. I wanted to show you something before we part ways, she said, her voice carrying a determination he hadn't heard from her in days. What is it? Kai asked, setting aside his packing to give her his full attention. Lyra activated the device, and a holographic display filled his quarters with complex mathematical equations, star charts, and what appeared to be architectural plans for some kind of space station. During our time together, I have been working on a theoretical project, she said, her ears shifting into their position of nervous excitement. A proposal for an independent research facility that would be positioned in neutral space between our two systems. Kai studied the hologram, recognizing elements of both human and Zephyrian technology integrated in ways he hadn't thought possible. This is incredible. But what's the purpose? Interspecies communication research, Lyra replied, her voice gaining strength as she explained her vision. A facility dedicated to developing better understanding between different species, not just humans and Zephyrians, but any intelligent life we encounter as we expand into the galaxy. The scope of this project. Kai traced some of the equations with his finger, marveling at the elegance of her theoretical framework. This would revolutionize how we approach first contact situations. But the funding alone would require support from multiple governments. Unless, Lyra said, her eyes meeting his with an intensity that reminded him of their first conversation in the ship's corridor, the facility were funded through private sources and operated as an independent research institute. Kai felt his heart rate increase as he began to understand what she was proposing. You want us to start our own research institution? I want us to create something that has never existed before, Lyra corrected, her luminescent skin beginning to glow more brightly as her excitement grew. A place where individuals from different species can work together without the constraints of governmental oversight or institutional politics. A laboratory for developing the kind of communication and understanding that our governments apparently find so threatening. Lyra, this is brilliant, but the practical challenges. Kai paused, studying her expression and realizing that she had already considered the obstacles he was about to raise. You've been planning this for weeks, haven't you? Since the first day I realized that our connection represented something our institutions couldn't accommodate, she admitted. I began to consider what it would take to create an environment where such connections could thrive rather than be suppressed. Kai looked at the holographic display again, seeing not just the technical specifications but the vision behind them, a future where love and scientific inquiry could coexist, where personal connections could enhance rather than compromise professional excellence. You're talking about leaving everything we've known and starting over with nothing but a theoretical framework and our faith in each other, he said slowly. Yes, Lyra replied simply. It could fail completely. We could lose everything and end up with nothing to show for it but good intentions and broken dreams. Yes, she said again, though her ears were now expressing the kind of joy he'd learned to associate with her most inspired moments. Kai studied her face, seeing in her expression the same mixture of terror and exhilaration he felt when contemplating their impossible future. Then he thought about the alternatives, returning to their respective worlds, spending the rest of their lives wondering what might have been if they'd been brave enough to choose each other over security. When you first asked me what I wanted, he said, moving closer until he could see the subtle patterns of light moving beneath her luminescent skin, I said I wanted you. But I think what I actually wanted was the possibility of becoming something I couldn't become alone. And what is that? Lyra asked softly. Someone capable of building bridges between worlds, Kai replied, reaching out to take her hand in the gesture that had become their own private language of connection. Someone who chooses love over fear, exploration over security, the unknown over the predictable. Lyra's skin brightened until she seemed to be glowing from within, her ears expressing pure, radiant joy as she squeezed his hand in return. In that case, she said, her voice carrying the same wonderful certainty that had marked their first honest conversation, I believe we should inform our respective governments that we will not be returning home as ordered. Any idea how we're going to fund an independent research station with no governmental backing and no institutional support? Kai asked, grinning despite the magnitude of what they were contemplating. I have been corresponding with several wealthy individuals from multiple species who are interested in supporting unconventional research projects, Lyra replied, and Kai realized that her planning had been far more comprehensive than he'd imagined. It appears that we are not the only ones who believe that institutional approaches to interspecies communication are inadequate. 6 months later, Dr. Kai Richardson and Dr. Lyra stood in the observation deck of their newly constructed research station, watching as the first group of research fellows from 12 different species arrived for the station's inaugural program. The facility, which they had named Nexus in recognition of its role as a connection point between worlds, represented the successful integration of technologies and funding sources that conventional wisdom had insisted was impossible. Any regrets? Kai asked, slipping his arm around his wife's waist in a gesture that had become natural despite the continued fascination it generated among their alien colleagues. Only that we waited so long to take the risk, Lyra replied, her ears expressing the contentment that had replaced her former diplomatic reserve. Though I suppose we needed time to become the people capable of building something like this. Speaking of building things, Kai said, grinning at the private joke they developed, how do you feel about building a family to go along with our research institute? Lyra turned to look at him with an expression of surprise that quickly shifted to delight. Are you suggesting that we add human Zephyrian hybrid offspring to our list of impossible projects? Why not? Kai replied, watching the stars whirl slowly past their observation window. We've gotten pretty good at turning impossible ideas into reality. In that case, Lyra said, standing on her toes to kiss him in the perfectly inefficient gesture she'd learned to love, I believe our next research project should be discovering whether love really can bridge every gap between worlds. What do you want, human? She had asked him once, and his answer had changed both their lives. Now, surrounded by the evidence of what they'd built together, Kai realized that his wants had evolved into something far more ambitious than he'd ever dared to imagine. He wanted a universe where differences were celebrated rather than feared, where love was recognized as a form of intelligence rather than dismissed as irrationality, where the impossible became simply another challenge to overcome through creativity and determination. Everything, he whispered against her luminescent skin, absolutely everything we can discover together. And in the laughter that followed, bright and joyful and utterly inefficient, Kai heard the sound of two worlds learning to speak the same language.